But we do have back with us Sarah Abdelshamy from the Palestinian Youth Movement. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's really an honor to have you. I think those who are, followers of Breakthrough News had the opportunity to see some of the massive march in solidarity with Palestine in Ottawa this past weekend. But I guess, for those of us watching in the United States, Canada is always presented as sort of the kinder, gentler country in North America. So talk a little bit, if you could, about what Canada's, relationship is to Israel.
Yeah. I think first and foremost, to understand Canada's support for the Zionist state of Israel, it's actually really crucial to note that what we're seeing today is not just the culmination of 75 years of Zionist aggression, but it's actually the culmination of Western imperialism in the region at large, right? And that Canada is actually a central part of US-led imperialism. So Palestine has been under 100 years of occupation, first by the British and then by the Zionists. And Israel was actually created by the backing of the British Empire and is now being backed by US imperialism with the support of Canada and the European Union. So I'm starting here because, when we understand Zionism as a project of imperialism, we can better understand Canada, America, and Western countries' support for Israel at large. And specifically here in this context, which is, the war on Gaza, Canada has actually pledged its support for Israel's mass genocide of the Palestinian people in material, diplomatic, as well as military ways. So in 2021, when Israel was attacking Gaza, Canada's arms exports to Israel increased by 33%, and they exported $26 million a year in military goods to Israel. So I actually want to pause here and kind of speak about two different, companies. The first is INCAS, which is a global conglomerate with multi-million-dollar contracts, and the headquarters are actually in Toronto. So the Israeli occupation forces and the Israeli police are both clients of this company. And this company sells remote-controlled weapons that are attached to tanks and armored vehicles. And this actually allowed soldiers to shoot weapons like machine guns, grenades, and cannons from the safety of their vehicles at a much faster rate than they would normally if they were to shoot them manually. And the headquarters are in Toronto. So another thing is, one of Canada's largest banks, which is Scotia Bank, has a $500 million investment in Elbit System, which, we know all too well, is an Israeli company that arms Israel's genocide against Palestinians. So this is why over the past couple of weeks, we've seen people take up escalatory actions and block or even picket weapons manufacturing companies and banks that are invested in weapons manufacturing, including both INCAS and Scotiabank. And, the longer that this genocide has gone on for, the more diverse the companies that activists target become. And, this just goes to show that there's a long, long list of silent killers that are in our own backyards. And of course, aside from the weapons export, Canada plays a really critical diplomatic role in supporting Israel. So we saw this on October 27. Canada actually voted to abstain on a UN General Assembly resolution that was calling for a ceasefire. And this is pretty consistent with the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's continued refusal to call for a ceasefire, despite, activists across the country from coast to coast protesting his presence, in front of conferences, mosques, restaurants, public appearances, etc. And, in addition to all of this, we also see that, just as in all imperialist nations, the media in Canada also serves the interests of the ruling class. We have media outlets here that are essentially working overtime to build public support for Israel's genocide against Palestinian people. And we've also seen people starting to demonstrate in front of these media institutions and conglomerates because people and the masses are identifying them as being complicit in this genocide. And, this is especially true in light of CTV's internal Palestine policy, which essentially it dictates that journalists should avoid using the word Palestine. And, other journalists have come out to say that there's a culture of fear that is being cultivated inside these media outlets, specifically CTV, that is suppressing the critical coverage of Israel's war on Gaza. So we see most mainstream outlets using terminologies like Israel-Hamas war, the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry. Palestinians die, but Israelis are killed. And, this is all part of a broader campaign, not just of deterring people from participating in displays, in public displays of support for Palestinian freedom, but it's a wider campaign of manufacturing consent and building public support for this genocide. But despite all of this, despite the Canadian political class and the media's best efforts, over 71% of Canadians supported a ceasefire as of mid-November. And organizers across the country, including the Palestinian Youth Movement, we've been working very hard to build a mass movement that confronts Canada's complicity in Israeli genocide and explicitly tries to shatter this perception of Canada as, like you said, the US's nice neighbor. And, we're working to organize the masses in a way that actually reflects this reality, which is, the Canadian imperialism continues to benefit from this genocide and the surveillance and repression of Palestinian communities and movements right here in North America.
I mean, there's something to be said that so many of these settler colonies around the world are Israel's biggest supporters, whether we're talking about the US or Canada or Australia. But, I'm curious, as we've seen in the United States, this play out domestically, at least, where you just have this wave of repression and censorship and people's livelihoods being threatened for speaking out, specifically targeting the Arab community, the Muslim community. I imagine there's something probably similar happening in Canada, despite the fact that we like to think our neighbors up north are somehow more civilized than the U.S. Is that something that people are dealing with as well in Canada, whether we're talking about in their workplaces, on college campuses, issues of harassment? I don't know if there's been any issues of anti-Arab, anti-Muslim violence, but if you could maybe speak to that.
Yeah. Absolutely. For as much support as we've seen across the country from coast to coast, we've also seen since October 7 efforts to magnify repression and defamation of Palestinian organizations and generally just of support of Palestine, right? So I'll give a couple of examples. So we have B'nai B'rith, right, which is a rabid right-wing anti-Muslim, anti-Arab group that has, pretty actively carried out campaigns and released statements that target Palestinian grassroots organizations. In the statement, B'nai B'rith wrote, with the support of Canadian politicians, urging Canadian police across the nation to shut down protests for Palestinian freedom that are taking place in Toronto, in Montreal, in Ottawa, and in Vancouver. And they actually vilified the rallies as, material support for Hamas. So these kinds of statements have a clear function, okay? Like the function is that they want to criminalize mass movements of people who are standing against the Israeli-led genocide. They want to wreak havoc across Palestinian communities. And they, most importantly, want to increase state surveillance and repression, which according to the National Council of Canadian Muslim, we've actually seen 1,300% increase in the number of hate incidents towards the Palestinian and Muslim communities in Canada since October 7. In Montreal, which is where I'm based, a woman with a Palestinian flag on her car was verbally harassed by a pro-Israel woman who identified herself as Lauren Wise. And, Lauren Wise then proceeded to hit the woman's car twice before driving away. In Calgary, a protester was arrested and charged with hate-motivated disturbance for chanting "From the river to the sea." So this is signaling an increase in police surveillance and suppression in an active attempt to deter people from participating in mass and public displays in support for Palestine. And, of course, we also need to highlight what's happening in the university campuses in Canadian universities, because students are actually facing an unbelievable amount of repression. So at McGill University, for example, there was a pro-Palestine policy that was endorsed by 78% of the student body, which was, with a record-breaking voter turnout. And this policy is called the Policy Against Genocide, and it demanded that McGill University cut ties with institutions, corporations, and donors that are complicit in Zionism. A few days later, the administration put out a statement condemning this policy, and a Quebec Superior Court halted the adoption of this policy, which is a crazy escalation, right? B'nai B'rith also filed an injunction to stop the student union from adopting this policy. In the same city, in Montreal, a Concordia University, there's a lawsuit that is being filed against the university and the student union that actively is painting pro-Palestine students and events that happen on campus as being anti-Semitic. So, really what we're seeing is imperialist agents scrambling, and they're trying as best as they can to suppress and contain the mass support that we are seeing happening across every sector in Canada. And so we're seeing concerted efforts on university campuses, in workplaces, where people are getting fired on the electoral level, with Sarah Jama, who's an MPP, who was fired for stating her solidarity with the Palestinian people. And Sarah Jama was actually, she actually spoke at the National March on Ottawa, and the same students that are facing repression have been organizing weekly events on their campuses and outside of their campuses, organizing student contingents. The people who are getting fired are pursuing legal action against their employers. So people are not capitulating to fear. So as much as there's backlash, there's also, quite honestly, been an incredible level of bravery that the masses are expressing in the face of this repression.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, Sarah, before we let you go, I also just want to ask you, many people did, of course, see the large demonstration that took place there in Ottawa this past weekend, but if you could just talk a little bit more, what have we seen in terms of solidarity with the Palestinian people in Canada? We've had a huge wave around the world. I assume it's a similar situation there.
Yeah. So the demonstration in Ottawa was on November 25th, and it really was a historic day. People from all over Canada, in cities like Montreal, Quebec City, Toronto, Alberta, and other neighboring and surrounding cities, took buses, booked trains, they flew, or they drove to the capital of Canada for what was the largest pro-Palestinian demonstration in Canadian history. So we all convened at the foot of Parliament Hill, where 100,000 people were standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people. And, part of what makes this demonstration so significant and powerful is that it actually came at the heels of the humanitarian pause, which Western countries, they've been largely framing as a solution to the war. But in reality, this pause is not a solution. And we know that the only thing that, will end this bloodshed is a permanent ceasefire, the lifting of the siege on Gaza, the release of our prisoners, and an end to Western complicity, and of course, an end to this occupation. So what this national march showed is that the masses, the Canadian masses, are not fooled by and are not going to be placated by, this so-called humanitarian pause. And that is precisely why 100,000 people in Canada took to Parliament Hill. And it was to make our demands very clear, to say that we see through this hypocrisy. And, we know that 5 days is not enough to bury our dead, to mourn the lives of the over 20,000 people killed. It's not enough to recover people who are still under the rubble. People need to be treated. Thousands of injured civilians need to be treated. And after this pause, Gaza will still be under a land, air, and sea blockade. blockade, as it has been for 16 years, where Israel controls everything that goes in and out. Gaza's infrastructure has been completely leveled. They're going to be needing an extraordinary amount of medical aid and access to building materials to actually be able to rebuild their lives and rebuild their homes that have all been destroyed. So, the first thing I kind of want to say is that this upsurge that we're seeing of mass support for the Palestinian struggle for liberation is, partly because the genocidal nature of the Israeli state has become undeniable. We're seeing a state that made the decision to murder 20,000 people because of the humiliating military defeat that they suffered at the hands of the Palestinian people. The prisoner exchange that we're seeing take place now was on the table on October 8th. And yet Israel chose to wreak death and destruction on Gaza and achieve none of its military goals. So we're also seeing collective punishment that's currently happening across the West Bank, where a number of Palestinian prisoners that are kept hostage in Israeli jails have nearly doubled in just under a month. And here, I want to refer to them as hostages because a significant number of the 8,300 prisoners are held under what we call administrative detention, which basically means that there is no charge, no trial, and you're held for an indefinite amount of time. So ultimately, we've reached a place where you can no longer deny these extraordinary acts of brutality and aggression, and we can no longer deny that it speaks to the genocidal nature of Israel. It's not an accident. It's actually a part of it, right? And then the last thing, or the second thing I wanted to say about this is that, what we're seeing is not just an upsurge of mass support for the Palestinian struggle. We're actually witnessing something much deeper and much more powerful. We're witnessing a shift in mass consciousness globally, right? So what the National March in Ottawa showed us is that the people are recognizing the contradictions. They are recognizing that the so-called democratic countries like the US and Canada are supporting this genocide. And these are countries that have never hesitated before to sanction countries, to place them under embargoes. If we look at Cuba, for example, Cuba has been under decades-long policies of economic embargoes at the hands of the U.S. empire. And this embargo has a specific aim, which is to prevent Cuba from fully exercising its right to self-determination. And actually, this embargo amounts to an act of war. And despite the mounting pressure to remove the blockade, the U.S. continues its attack on Cuba precisely because they present a real threat to imperialism, not just in their region, but in the world. So here we're talking about, Western countries that have interfered in the political, economic, military, and domestic affairs of countless countries across the world, but especially in the global south. They have launched coups, they have placed them under embargoes, they have waged wars, all in the name of human rights and democracy. And yet, we are now seeing one of the most publicized and televised displays of genocide, images that are genuinely impossible to stomach, let alone, understand or process. And these same countries are refusing to even condemn the war crimes, let alone take active measures to or position to stop these war crimes. So, it's become really clear to the people of Canada and, of the world that these Western countries are loyal to not the so-called morals and values of democracy, but to their ideological and economic interests, which ultimately amounts to advancing the imperialist project across the globe. And, Palestine and the unity of the Palestinian movement in this moment is exposing the facade of Western imperialism. And it's showing the masses in Canada that, this government, doesn't serve our class interests.
Mm-hmm. Sarah Abdelshamy, an organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement, we are very, very thankful for you giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you.